Now, to turn to today's reading, the argument is the one at the end of the first part. Rousseau takes on an elaborate consideration of history and the effect of the arts and sciences on whole nations. I want to step back again into the last pages of the last reading. The whole section of the text starts here on page 36 with a paragraph we spent time on last class, the middle paragraph of the right column, where the plain thesis is articulated. So, of course, that's very useful for you so that you can orient yourself to know where the whole argument is going. Now, before I go in detail about that argument, I think it might be useful if I talk a little about what this corruption means. Rousseau talks about it all the time and explains it sometimes explicitly in detail, sometimes abstractly, but it may help us to get a clearer idea of what kind of corruption this is, and I think it will be something that you can see around you. Note that many people complain about the modern consumer culture. We seem to care an awful lot about products you can buy. People are interested, they put a value and importance on specific brands of things. How did that happen? Something that is clearly conventional. A brand, nothing could be more literally conventional than that. How did it happen that matters to people's lives? And they judge their own success through the brands that they can afford and to show, and they judge other people by their allegiance to brands. Often the things that we care about, the movies we love or the music that we love, take on this character when they should speak to our hearts, but they seem to be markers in the social game, conventions that we play and trade with one another like cards. So consider how people feel about their cars. Now, cars are very expensive, and you have to do a lot to get one, and you have to have a good job in order to afford one. That means doing work that maybe you don't want to do. It means obeying a boss that perhaps you don't like, perhaps you don't respect, maybe somebody who doesn't have your best interest at heart. Why do people go through all that trouble to get the product? Well, of course, they have to get around, but really, what's faster? Riding a bicycle or taking a bus, and therefore not having to do the tedious and time-consuming work in order to afford the car, or to do all that extra stuff and be able to drive. When you add up the net, people lose time because of their cars. And it's a kind of slavishness to purely conventional things that Rousseau says is opposed to real virtue. At the start of the review lecture, the lectures for today's, I praised AUIS students for their attachment to education, their respect for education. I talked about how that was maybe getting in your way to understand Rousseau's argument and his ideas, but perhaps Rousseau would have some doubts about this taste of yours. What, after all, is the point of your education? Of course, you will get a good transcript, and you will be able to trade that transcript for a good job. And so, from a certain point of view, that makes perfect sense. But if a brand is clearly a sign of merely conventional and not natural things, surely a transcript is too. Your wisdom and your virtue are not recorded on that page, as valuable as it is in the society with the conventions we've got. Think about how many strange and unnatural things you do every day for the sake of your education. Things that you never would have imagined you wanted, things that wouldn't have appealed to your own self before you entered the university, now just seem to be the markers of success and failures in your life. Why is it that you think of pleasing your professor by reading a strange book rather than doing something to please yourself? And as Rousseau will say, following your own genius. How did it happen that this highly conventional activity, the university with its own unnatural standards of succeeding or failing, began to dominate your life? Why is it so hard to live in a natural way if your schooling is pointing in some different direction? Your life seems to be just fine, but your professors seem to think you're lacking. Why is it that their opinion matters more than your own? This is the kind of critique that Rousseau might give. And if that's hard on us, hard on me, hard on our way of life, we should respect the argument and see what it has to teach us, either because we accept it or maybe because we learn how to reject it and see what's wrong with it. So now let me turn more deliberately to the argument, which, as I said before, starts here on page 36. So middle paragraph of the right-hand column, we see Rousseau articulating the basic thesis that he's illustrating through this whole book. He spells it out elaborately with a metaphor. This is based on the relationship between the moon and the tides. You understand, of course, that the ocean sloshes back and forth. If you're near the shore, sometimes the water runs in and you get a flow tide. There seems to be more of it. It's coming up toward you, and sometimes it runs out. You get an ebb tide. The ocean seems to be draining out or drying up. Now Rousseau uses that in his allegory as a marker for virtue in some times and places. Virtue seems to be flowing in and rising, and sometimes in places it seems to be running out and falling. Now, scientifically, of course, we know that the moon has a major control of the tides. It's the gravity of the moon that pulls the water towards itself that makes this phenomenon happen. So it's clever of Rousseau to co-opt scientific discoveries. Nothing is more emblematic of the advances of the sciences in the modern world than the understanding of physics and gravity and how the solar system affects things down here on Earth. A true understanding rather than the nonsense and magic of astrology. So he co-opts the scientific discovery to make a counter-scientific metaphor. When the moon rises, the water runs out, and when the moon sets, the water comes back in. So it's what physicists would call an inverse relationship, and the moon there stands for the sciences and the arts, just as the ocean water stands for virtue. One clever thing about this metaphor is that as an emblem, a sign of sciences and the arts, Rousseau uses something that shines light on all of us. That's natural. But he doesn't use the sun, which is traditional to philosophy. The sun is steady. It's the original source of all life. It's powerful and shines a bright light on things so we see them clearly. The moon is different in all those ways. It's unsteady. It wavers in its course. It changes its shape. It goes from blank to quarter to half to full and back again. It's not constant, keeps changing. And the light is dim and it's reflected. It doesn't really have illumination of its own, but borrows it from some other source and can only show us partially and badly how things are. So that is how Rousseau sees all of history working. That as there's a mental advance, as educational things rise, as sciences and the arts rise, then virtue runs out. So the pattern is simple. We see it in the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks in their early days were a simple people and managed to hold on to their freedom. An astonishing event, the largest army that the world had ever seen. Millions of Persians, soldiers and sailors invaded Greece, and tens of thousands of Greeks fought them back. But later the Greeks fell in love with their own sophistication, the great arts and the sciences that they were developing. And this led them to lose focus on what really counted, to the point of being conquered by the Macedonians, and then never really regaining their strength. They were conquered in turn by other people, including the Romans. The Romans had a similar career. They had been simple shepherds and farmers. And in that state, through their great patriotism, their obedience to the law, the willingness to take risks and to shed blood for their country, they became a great political power. But unfortunately for the Romans, when the Romans conquered the Greeks physically, the Greeks conquered the Romans intellectually. The Romans discovered Greek sophistication, their very impressive sciences, and their superior arts. And Roman citizens began to want to be measured in that way by their mental advancement rather than their physical strength. And the results were inevitable. Small details will help us bring this part of the argument to life. Here on page 37, the bottom of the middle column, Rousseau mentions the event that he thinks of as the ultimate disaster. Anybody could see the battles where Rome lost its freedom, but what was the real catalyst for this bad event? What was the real cause? Well, Rousseau says it was when they gave political power to someone who had the title of arbiter of good taste, that politics, which should be reserved for courageous people and patriots and good practical organizers, that political power was given to someone who had elegant manners and who could set the conventional tone, or choose the conventions that other people had to live up to or could be condemned for falling short of. And Rousseau says, well, that was the real defeat, and the actual fatal battle was just an inevitability after that.